The Crimes and Exploitation of Native Americans, A Dark History of America. Imagine a land where civilizations thrived for thousands of years, where people lived in harmony with nature, passed down sacred traditions, and built rich cultures long before the arrival of Europeans. Now, imagine that land being stolen, its people slaughtered, and its survivors forced into centuries of suffering. This is not just history. It's a reality that shaped the foundation of the United States. A story of greed, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty. Today, we uncover the dark, hidden crimes committed against Native Americans, from genocide to forced assimilation, from the arrival of Columbus to the injustices still happening today. This is the painful truth they never taught in school. Chapter 1. Columbus and the Beginning of Genocide. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, forever changing the fate of the indigenous people of the Americas. He described the native Taino people as peaceful and generous, but within years, they were enslaved, tortured, and massacred. Columbus and his men forced native people to mine gold under brutal conditions. If they failed to meet their quota, their hands were cut off. Some were burned alive, while others were hunted for sport. Within 50 years, nearly 90% of the Taino population was wiped out. The Spanish, English, and other European powers continued this brutal conquest. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, brought by the settlers, ravaged native populations, killing millions, sometimes even before they had made first contact with Europeans. This biological catastrophe, combined with warfare and enslavement, resulted in one of the largest genocides in human history. Chapter 2. The First Massacres and Land Theft. European settlers saw the vast lands of North America as an opportunity for expansion, disregarding the people who had lived there for thousands of years. The Pequot Massacre, 1637. In one of the first recorded acts of genocide in what would become the U.S., English settlers and their native allies attacked a Pequot village in present-day Connecticut, burning it to the ground and killing 500 to 700 men, women, and children. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676. One of the deadliest wars in American history, relative to population, saw English settlers systematically destroy native villages. Captured Native Americans were sold into slavery, shipped to the Caribbean, and never returned. The Indian Wars, 1600s to 1800s. Over the next 2 centuries, settlers and later the U.S. government waged relentless wars to eliminate native resistance. These included the Yamasee War, the French and Indian War, and numerous conflicts against the Apache, Comanche, and other tribes. The strategy was clear: kill the native population or force them into submission. Chapter 3. Manifest Destiny and Forced Removals. By the 19th century, the U.S. government openly pursued policies of native displacement under the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand westward, no matter the cost. The Trail of Tears, 1830s. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, forcing tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole people to relocate to barren lands in present-day Oklahoma. On the journey, over 4,000 Cherokee alone died from freezing temperatures, starvation, and disease. Many native leaders, including Chief John Ross, pleaded for mercy, but the U.S. government ignored them. The Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. In Colorado, U.S. soldiers under Colonel John Chivington attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village, despite the tribe waving a white flag of surrender. Over 230 native people were murdered, many women and children. Survivors reported horrific mutilations, with soldiers cutting off body parts as trophies. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. The U.S. Army surrounded a Lakota Sioux camp, demanding they surrender their weapons. A shot was fired. Historians still debate from which side, and chaos erupted. Over 300 Lakota men, women, and children were slaughtered, many while fleeing or unarmed. The massacre marked the end of armed native resistance against the U.S. Chapter 4. Broken Treaties and Cultural Erasure. Despite signing hundreds of treaties promising land and protection, the U.S. government systematically broke almost every single one. The Dawes Act, 1887. native lands were divided into small plots, forcing natives to adopt European farming practices. Surplus land was sold to white settlers, stripping natives of 90 million acres of land. Native boarding schools, 1800s to 1900s. Kill the Indian, save the man. This was the motto of U.S. government-run boarding schools. Native children were forcibly taken from their families, forbidden to speak their language, and punished for practicing their culture. Many suffered physical and sexual abuse and died from neglect and malnutrition. Chapter 5: 20th Century Oppression, Sterilization, and Exploitation. Even in the 20th century, Native Americans continued to face government-backed atrocities. Forced sterilization, 1960s to 1970s. Between 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized without their consent under federal programs. Many discovered years later that they had undergone surgery. This was part of a larger effort to erase Native populations. Exploitation of Native lands. The U.S. government continued to exploit reservations for oil, uranium, and other resources while leaving Native communities in poverty. Toxic waste from mining poisoned Native land and water supplies, causing cancer and birth defects. Chapter 6: Native Resistance and the Fight for Justice. Despite centuries of oppression, Native Americans never stopped fighting. The American Indian Movement, AAM, 1968-present, led protests to demand civil rights, land rights, and an end to police brutality against Native people. The occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 brought national attention to broken treaties and government abuse. Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline, 2016. Thousands of Native and non-Native activists gathered to protest the construction of an oil pipeline threatening Sioux water supplies. Despite peaceful protests, police used rubber bullets, tear gas, and water cannons in freezing temperatures to suppress activists. Chapter 7: Where are Native Americans today? Despite the struggles, Native American communities are still resilient and thriving. In many parts of the U.S., largest Native American populations today, Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico have the highest Native American populations. The Navajo Nation is the largest reservation, covering 27,000 square miles across Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. Other large tribes include the Cherokee, Lakota Sioux, Apache, and Choctaw. Modern Native activism and culture. Many Native American communities are reviving their languages, traditions, and customs after centuries of suppression. Native American politicians are now serving in Congress, such as Deb Haaland, the first Native American Secretary of the Interior. Indigenous-led movements are fighting for land rights, environmental justice, and the return of stolen artifacts and remains. The crimes against Native Americans were not isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate and systematic effort to erase an entire people. Despite centuries of oppression, Native communities continue to fight for their rights, reclaim their history, and preserve their cultures. It's time to acknowledge this dark past, not to dwell in guilt, but to seek justice and ensure these crimes are never repeated. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content uncovering hidden history. Let's keep these stories alive.